All right. Well, thank you guys so much again for your willingness to be interviewed and talk about your work. My students are always very curious about what people do post-graduation. And I try to tell them, like, there's so many options, but it's helpful to get to hear from you all. And my other sort of ulterior motive is for them to hear about how you guys are conceptualizing and understanding your work, and the very special population you guys work with. So Joe and Lori, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves and say a bit about your background, as well as kind of where you are now.
Sure. Okay. I'll start. My name is Joe Noble. I have a master's degree in psychology, and I work I practice as a licensed marriage and family therapist here in Minnesota. We're up in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. We jointly own the Bridging Center, which is a family therapy center. We do both clinical work as well as parent education. We're probably mostly known for our Bridging Parental Conflict class. We teach about close to 1,500 parents a year here in Minnesota and in other states as well. It's all online now because of the pandemic. And so we have access, or people around the country have access to it. And it's really targeting parents in the, maybe in the more conflicted divorces, and maybe the 20% of divorces that are more conflicted. And that is the target area that the Bridging Center tends to work with. We have a variety of scenarios that we can maybe run through later in this conversation. But mostly what we do is family therapy of some sort. We both do some individual therapy. I do some couples therapy and some blending families therapy. I do a little bit of work with survivors of domestic violence. But mostly what we do is family therapy in some capacity. We're always looking at things from a systemic perspective. And part of that work in the family area is doing some coaching. Sometimes parents just need some coaching, parent coaching, or if it's post-divorce, co-parent coaching. And we tend to work collectively here, so we're addressing all or as many parts of the family system as possible. And that includes also working with colleagues in the family law area and the family court system as well.
Okay. My name is Lori Thibodeau. I am a marriage and family therapist. I have my master's degree in psychotherapy and then licensed by the Board of Minnesota here for marriage and family therapy. As Joe said, so the two of us own the Bridging Center together, and we do a lot of classes. For me, so I mainly work, so my caseload mainly consists of families that are in high conflict. And for me, it's kind of a variation of sometimes I'm working with just the kids, sometimes I'm working with just the parents, or some combination. But as Joe mentioned, we have a pretty systemic lens around here. So when I'm working with the kids, I'm making sure, do I understand the system as a whole? And when I'm working with the adults, do I understand how the kids are doing? For us, I think every family that comes through here, we really hold on to that systemic lens because we often equate that family system to the baby mobile, right? You push one piece and all the pieces move, and we really hold that belief very dearly here. And especially when we look at high conflict divorce cases or systems, we refer to them as complex systems. So that's a better way to look at it. They're very complex, and we really need to have that systemic lens to understand all the dynamics that are moving at any given time.
Yeah. So I've been taking notes here of all the things I think my students will go, what's that? So, because I'm tracking because I've been to one of your classes and I've gotten to see you guys work. And I was in the high conflict world for a while until I figured out like it was going to burn me out in a hot second.
We're speaking in code, right?
What's that?
We're speaking in code, right?
Yeah. And so, but I think you're bringing up really important elements that I want them to understand. So you guys mentioned both conflicted divorce and high conflict. So can you guys kind of define what that looks like or what that means and what you see in families in terms of when it manifests?
You want me to start? Okay. So the way that I conceptualize this is that if you think of all divorces on a spectrum, where like 0 is there's no conflict at all, they get along, they're friends, they maybe attend holidays together, and it just the marriage piece just didn't work out, but the relationship is actually pretty strong. It's almost like a friendship. All the way to the other extreme, where there's just bitterness and hatred, and they have to be isolated from each other. We work with probably the 20% at the other extreme, and those we would consider high conflict or complex, as Lori said, complex family systems, because there's so much conflict between the parents. And then say between that 20 on the one extreme and say the next 30, I'm going to think in terms of percentages. So 20% is high conflict. The next 30% would be conflicted. I don't think it's unusual that when people get divorced, there's some conflict. Divorce is an incredibly difficult thing to go through, incredibly stressful, and we don't make our best decisions when we're under that tremendous amount of stress, and so it creates some conflict. But usually those 30% can work themselves out of it. Okay? They might need a little guidance, maybe a little coaching, probably some grief and loss therapy. But you know, after a year or two, things calm down and they can more or less get along just fine, and the children feel less adverse effects of that conflict. So when we talk, that's how I think about how I conceptualize conflicted families and high conflict families.
And I would add to that the other piece of that 20% sitting at this end, that high conflict or complex case, they're wrapped in the court systems here in Minnesota. And so whereas most people, when you consider divorce, can actually just hire an attorney, get things done, write their documents or decrees, and it's over. The people we are talking about get stuck in the court system and cannot get out. And so they can be in the court system for years and years. Like, you know, a typical divorce may take a year or so. I mean, these are people who could be locked in for 5 to 10 years of fighting and spending an incredible amount of money. There are also individuals or systems that they have a lot of professionals involved in the system. So not only do we have judges and attorneys, and we can talk about these pieces because I know, Katie, you know, but parenting consultants, guardian ad litems get involved. There's so many people. And what we recognize when we think of a systemic lens, all of those players become a part of the system. And so is it useful or not useful? Are they aggravating the system? And so we need to recognize what's happening with that kind of conflict, and the movement of all the professionals play a part in this.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because when you guys said complex system, my mind went somewhere else, but now I'm following what you're saying, where they become a part of the action. Like what happens out there will come in your therapy office, but it might be from an attorney as opposed to someone's mother, right? Like that there's additional important and influential players.
And not only that, but teachers, kids teachers, pediatricians,
individual therapists, right? Individual therapists.
Yeah. Sometimes the people that create the biggest problems in the system are other professionals.
That's really important, because I think that's something that, at least when I think about my education and even myself as an educator, I'm not sure how much I talk about that, about how important these other professionals are in sort of speaking into your client or stoking the conflict in some way. I don't know if you guys have a good example of that, or I
can give a little example. I would say, so from an individual therapist point of view. So it's very easy. So you're talking about systems, or an individual within the system out of a divorce or is getting divorced that may have an incredible amount of hurt and pain, right? And they take that hurt and pain, and it's often kind of covered up or masked with anger and frustration. And they might bring that to their individual therapist. And if an individual therapist doesn't have a systemic lens and just takes all of that at face value and not really understand, sometimes we'll see individual therapists diagnose someone they've never met. Well, I'm pretty sure your ex-husband is a narcissist. And of course, we recognize that as being unethical because that's not your client. And so, what it actually does is it keeps that individual more stuck. right? Because the lens becomes about the other person versus the work that they can be doing on themselves. And so for us, we teach other folks here, other therapists in Minnesota about these dynamics. And for us, we really want to follow those AFCC guidelines of court-ordered therapy. And, you know, your students can look at that as well. Joe can probably give a little more information on it, but that's kind of one example. But we can even break it down to remembering that attorneys advocate for their clients. They zealously advocate for their clients. And so their job is not to look systemically, right? Their job. So sometimes you get attorneys that work together, which is really wonderful. And sometimes you have attorneys that don't. And so, and when you have an agenda or a push for your clients, sometimes it's aggravating all those hurt and emotions that have not been worked out yet, right? Making it more difficult.
Right. Well, attorneys, I mean, my experience of them, if they weren't collaborative law attorneys, didn't have that collaborative piece or think about that as being useful. They sort of, you know, they're playing to win for their clients. And so if they win, then somebody loses in this scenario.
That's right. And I think the really experienced family law attorneys or divorce attorneys understand that if that's their approach, if they're out to win for their client, the family will lose. Mm-hmm. The losing member of that competition is not the other parent, it's the family.
Yeah.
And family and attorneys have to understand that. Otherwise, they're going to harm the family. And they do, on a regular basis, harm the family. And then they send them to us to figure out what to do. And others, not just us, but others as well.
And I think that is part of the issue. So, you know, if you look at parents who are divorcing, they're fighting over the most important people in their lives, their children, right? And none of us wants to be away from our children, right? We're not meant to really be away from our kids. And so all of a sudden that's getting pulled at. And so they start to fight. And so really when you think about the family law community, different than any other like civil law or criminal law, family law is not about winning and losing. We have an attorney, a friend of ours, who often say there's no justice in family court. And that's very true, because when you're looking at a family, there isn't a win-lose dynamic, right? It's about truth and perspective, right? And so they're fighting for their truths. And that becomes very difficult, right? Very painful. And then the kids get pulled into that dynamic.
Right. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit, maybe in terms of theory, sort of what guides this idea of, I mean, they understand systems and that kind of thing. But if you guys have sort of I don't know, like a little spiel you get about sort of theoretically what you see and what you're looking for about these families in that high conflict place.
You want me to go? Okay. Well, we are both trained extensively in Adlerian psychology from Alfred Adler's perspective. We've obviously studied many of the other theories out there, but fundamentally we look at this as a socially oriented endeavor. That's what a family is. A family is a collection of relationships, and we all figure out how to live together in those relationships. And we create, you know, Adler's word for that is belongingness. And we pursue and we create that belongingness in all of our, any community of people, whether it's Laurie and I sitting here, the three of us right now on this Zoom call, your students who will be viewing this at some point, we're all creating some kind of a shared identity. Even if it's for a short period of time, that's what we do. We do it in our neighborhoods, we do it in our organizations, and we, of course, we do it fundamentally and first and foremost in our families. And that's the core of the Adlerian psychology. So we come at it from that perspective. Not to mention that Adler was also very an advocate of education. So we do both of those things. But what we look for on a practical and clinical perspective is where is the chaos in the family? What structures could help counter the chaos? Because structure and predictability counters chaos. And then we work with the families to figure out how to implement some structure. We also, of course, have this other entity called family law that is speaking into that, because sometimes a judge will give us an order that says this family is to do this work. The parenting times would be this. We, as therapists, we don't decide parenting time, right? We can make a recommendation for some time together if it's for a clinical purpose or to achieve a treatment plan, but we don't get into any recommendation for any kind of ongoing parenting time, visitation rights. All of that belongs in the legal side of things. So sometimes the courts will send that objective or that goal with us. Sometimes the parents will bring it. Maybe they've decided that goal through mediation or some other way that the goal comes to us. And then we will structure the treatment plan to achieve that goal. But what we're fundamentally looking for is how to stabilize the family. These families are typically chaotic, very poor decision-making, at least poor joint decision-making. They probably would prefer to just make unilateral decisions, but that's part of what gets them into the chaos, right?
Yeah.
And they're not particularly good at following agreements, either legal or non-legal agreements. And so we're looking for that kind of structure to help them with that. And then we are also setting up processes for coaching. Most of them don't think they need therapy. And so we don't necessarily try to convince them of that, because that would be a whole different piece of the work. And usually we're not asked to do that. But they do need coaching, because they do not understand. It's a really difficult thing, and most of us wouldn't understand how to go about this. So structure around goals, and then guiding the parents along that treatment plan and that structure.
Yeah. So you see your role in terms of that Adlerian background as being somebody who comes to, this sounds really sharp, but I would say enforce, but sort of like holds the line in some way on like, well, this is the structure that's been either passed down to us or appears to be needed. Is that fair?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, in fact, we almost require that the goals come from outside the therapy, so we don't compromise our neutral position. Right.
So you can just very neutrally say, well, this is what we have to do.
That's right. They can be upset about it, frustrated about it, but we didn't decide it, because we can still maintain that neutral position. And also that applies when we're working with the children too, because the children would really not like to do the work, because it's pretty uncomfortable work at times. And we can sympathize with that and have compassion around that and understand that, but we're still going to do the work, right? And actually in working with those families through roadblocks like that, we actually guide them in a process of resilience development, because most of these families are pretty rigid. Okay. And if we think about things like the adverse childhood experiences and the resilience that's needed to counter some of that, these families fundamentally, whether it preceded the divorce or because of the divorce, don't have that resilience. And so it's an opportunity to help them learn some of that resilience, or at least introduce them to it as they achieve the treatment goals. Maybe you could talk about holding the family.
Well, I want to just back up just 1 second. I think one of the things, so Joe's kind of covered it, but for your students to recognize, much of what Joe and I do is court ordered. So these are not families necessarily coming in on their own volition, wanting to do this work. So it is different, right? When we have a court order kind of driving the work. And so our roles, that's why when we talk about those AFCC guidelines, it's really important, because there's lots of different variations of the type of therapist you are in court-ordered work. And so like community therapists, court-ordered therapists, and your students can kind of look at that guideline. It might be helpful. But it is different, because they're being court-ordered to do a specific work. Our job is not to decide on the work, but to help them with what has been ordered and to help move and stabilize the family. So when you asked about theories, right? So again, system, structural, right? And then just coming at the lens from an Adlerian lens, kind of that whole system, family, and how we move together. So our job, right? And the other piece I want to add is that, so there's enough studies now. I'm sure one of your students is thinking, well, with all this chaos, is there diagnosis? And You know, and so one of the things we recognize, you can probably read a number of studies that these clients that are at this end, right, that conflicted, complex side, probably that 20%, that there is a percentage of them that likely have some type of personality disorder. So there's plenty of studies that show that. However, that being said, the work that Joe and I do is not evaluative, right? So as therapists, we're doing the relational work. So we don't focus as much on the diagnosis. Somebody else may have given a diagnosis, but we're really looking at the behavior, right? How does that behavior, because when we talk about boundaries, I'm not going to have a boundary with a narcissist. I'm going to have a boundary with the behavior that's presented from a narcissist. So we need to figure out, how do we address the behaviors so we know the appropriate boundaries to put up? Because these are family systems that people often think divorce, they get to separate, but they need to communicate. They need to make decisions together, right? And so, and it's very,
they need to attend activities together.
Right.
They need to be involved in some way. They don't get to just go to their sidelines and not engage in the game. They still have to.
right. And so you may be helping somebody learn how to have a boundary with another parent who has no boundaries. And so there's a lot of movement of figuring out what is each person's work and how do they come to the table and do that work, right? And then the difficulty of being court ordered to do this is that we, as therapists, we can't make anyone do anything they don't want to do. And so we have an ethical obligation to kind of look at the system, figure out what do each of these individuals within the system need to create the most stability for each other, the parental dynamic, and to support their children. And if they're not able to do that, it's not ethical for us to continue the work. We actually have to name the issues and the problems and push it back to the parents who can bring it back to the court, right? Because you don't want to be working harder than your clients here and spinning around. They still have autonomy in the process, right? Even though they've been ordered, it's not our job to follow their order. Yeah. And so we want to make sure we've given them all the tools, all of the information they need to know what needs to happen. And then it becomes choice, right? And so we have to make the call to say, it looks like you're not willing to do this, or you're really struggling to do this. So we may send it back to the court for an evaluation. Is this the appropriate process for this family? Is there something we're missing because we're not evaluators, right? And kind of putting it back out there.
Well, it's so interesting because we use that line a lot around here, like don't work harder than your client. And I think what I started thinking about when you said that was even in court-ordered cases where they are sent to you, it's still not your job to make something happen.
That's right.
You can present the information, you can do all the empathizing and be compassionate and do all the things you know to do, and then it's up to the family to engage. And they're responsible for that part of it. The other interesting thing I heard in there was, you know, you describe these families as both chaotic and rigid. And I think what throws students sometimes is we think of chaos as like a free-for-all, and rigidity is like some very contained right thing. And so can you guys talk a little bit about how those two things meet in these families?
So you're asking the easy questions, Katie, is that? You want to go ahead?
Sorry.
Sure. Well, I was thinking, I wonder if it would be helpful to like think of it on the perspective of the teeter-totter, right? The rigidity is so the teeter-totter, Joe often references the teeter-totter. So I'm right, you're wrong, right? I win, you lose, right? So that's always this dynamic of rigidity. The chaos happens when the other person says, no, I'm right, you're wrong, right? And so we end up with this movement of like reaction. Right? Systems don't like change, right? We can sit in that systems, homeostasis, whatever word you want to put in there, but systems do not like change. And somebody says I'm right, and the other person says no, and the system just moves and reacts constantly to all these changes. Even if somebody ends up with a good boundary, right? I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to engage. The system will always respond and react, and most often in a negative way, until this person hopefully in its point engages. And so there's rigidity, but chaos often happening. And then to the point of what I said about all these professional players that are involved, we're creating change. We're poking at the system, and the system is constantly reacting to that as well. So you have rigid, you have individual rigid thought, but there's chaos in the movement.
Right. As the rigidity collides. I mean, that's part of the sort of, there's rigidity on both ends or multiple ends, and then it all collides. And if we're overly rigid, there's no one wants to agree with anyone, and now we have like conflict and chaos and all of that.
So
That's right.
that's a great way to describe it. In fact, if you think about it this way, the chaos is first felt by the children. Because at this parent's home, I do this, I'm supposed to do this. At this parent's home, I'm supposed to do something completely different. And then the parents react because I'm just doing what I was just told to do at the other home, but now I'm at this other home and I can't keep it all straight because I'm only 9 years old or 10 years old. And then the parent's response to that, which is to be rigid, is then to fire off an email or a phone call to the other parent, which then gets the parent defensive. Now you're on the teeter-totter, and suddenly the kid is going, well, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
And the parents don't know what to do either, right? They only know what to do. They only know that they do what they've always done.
Right.
So that's where you see a lot of the chaos. And then you have children making decisions for themselves in all of that they are not developmentally equipped to make, or are just misdirecting their compassion and caring in some way, so they're taking care of the family system. And I could sit and give you example after example after example. I'm sure you've got plenty of them, but yeah.
Well, but you're making me, like, I think one of the other questions my students likely have is, so like, what happens to the kids in the midst of this? In the midst of the rigidity and chaos? I know there's research on that. I've certainly seen that, but maybe you guys can talk a little bit about what you see as an outcome, probably developmentally at different levels, but that sounds like a pretty terrible
sure. So in our class that we teach, the Bridging Parental Conflict class, I spend a lot of time talking about what do children actually experience in the midst of these transitions. And they're experiencing four things. I mean, generally four categories. They're adapting to physical changes because everything is different at each home. Everything is physically different, right? They are managing their parents' conflict. Some people would say the fact that they have to live in two homes is an example of managing their parents' conflict, right? Mm-hmm. But every time they walk in the door, they're reading the parent's face, they're reading the feel of the room, they are wondering, is it okay if I say this or not say this to this parent or the other parent? They're constantly managing their parents' conflict. They're adjusting to different relationships in each home. That could include step-parents, but it could also include a sibling who isn't talking to the other parent whose house I just came from. So there's all sorts of relationships that they're adjusting to. And then they're just generally reorganizing their lives. And they're doing things that developmentally they're probably not capable of doing, like thinking about 3 days from now. Children don't think, I mean, especially from like middle school and younger, right? They're just learning in middle school how to think strategically, right? Those younger kids don't think that way. And so we're asking them to do all sorts of things that they're really poorly, well, never mind poorly, it's not the kids' fault. It's just difficult for kids. It's difficult for parents to do this, right? So they're making up all sorts of different ways to manage all this stuff. We always say children are terrific observers of the world, but terrible interpreters. So they are making up all sorts of meaning about all of this stuff. Yeah. And it's hard. We actually help create a list of symptoms of the children's, or what we call behavior changes due to the conflicts. And it makes total sense that the children would have those behaviors given their family system. It makes total sense. And so it's really challenging. And then, of course, parents don't know what to do about it except blame the other parent, which just creates more of the problem. Throws gas on the fire.
Well, and given enough conflict, right, we know children will create alignments, right? They're trying to stabilize the system the best they can. Again, they're managing it because the parents aren't able to manage it, right? And so if we understand a parental system or a system from like a genogram point of view, right, you have the adults and then you have the line, right? And our colleague Deb Link always says, everybody above the line makes decisions, everybody below that line follows the decisions. But when there's enough chaos, that line breaks down, right? So we don't have to look at it as a marriage line in the divorce, we just need to look at it as a functional parenting line. And so that's what they need to create. And if that breaks down, the children will slide up into the middle, into the cracks. and we will start to see alignments, right? Which is obviously, we recognize as therapists, alignments are not helpful in a system. And my personal definition of conflict is pick a side. That's how I see it for kids. Pick a side.
Pick a side.
Right? Pick a side, because they have to do something to create the most calm they can. If you're a child and you're living in chaos and you have parents speaking badly about the other person, or they're telling you their side, the other person's telling you their side, and you're just trying to figure out the truth, it becomes too much. And so a child will eventually align with one parent, which then goes back to the court system, and the court system sends it back to therapy that says, untie this, figure this out, repair the system. And it's not so easy to do.
Yeah. Yeah, you're making me think of the cases I worked on, which were the ones where there was, what's the word for that? Where there's
Or reunification.
Reunification, yes, where there's this need because there's been the separation between one of the parents and the kiddo, and then they've completely aligned with the other parent. And so that makes a lot of sense what you guys are describing. I mean, the outcomes I've seen from research are pretty awful.
And I think in those cases, the parent who's not seeing the child, of course, is scared and anxious and devastated. They're wondering, you know, something's not right with their children, or the family, of course, is they're worried about their kids. And they think that the solution is to go back to court. And every time we work with these families, whether we're teaching our class or whether we're with the family, the parents themselves, there's nothing the court can do except send you back to therapy. This is not a legal problem. The best the court's going to be able to do is order parenting time and send you back to therapy to make it happen. So sometimes parents, that's a hard thing for parents, especially the parent who's not seeing the child, to get their head around, because they want somebody to just order it to change.
Right.
It's not going to happen that way.
And just to recognize that other parent is terrible. Don't they know that that was what I heard all the time was like, well, I got to go to court because I got to find out dad's a narcissistic something.
If I could just quick comment on that, Katie. The number one thing that parent who's not seeing the children should do to improve things is stop blaming the other parent. It will fundamentally change their participation in the conflict. And it has to happen. If it doesn't happen, if you're ever working with these families and that parent who's not seeing the children doesn't stop blaming, it will fail. It will not work. Or it will rarely work. Let's put it that way. I shouldn't say never, but it will rarely work.
And I think, especially for your students, recognizing that they may have one or two of these clients along the way. And so we need to recognize, as the professionals who work in these systems, that these are systems that are grieving and they're in pain, and nobody likes to grieve. Nobody wants to grieve. And we look at grief often most commonly with death, right? But we're talking about the grief, the loss of the intact family, right? And the grief is different because they will continue to see the other parent, someone that may have betrayed them, somebody like all that pain, and the children need to grieve. And if the parents haven't grieved, the children likely haven't grieved. And so if we understand like the grief and loss process, what they need to come to is acceptance. This is our new normal. This is what we have to come to. And so we use colors around here to describe like what parents need to do. And so I'll kind of tell your students and it'll make sense. So we'll say parent one, parent A, right? So just the two different parents. So when we think of acceptance, right? Parent one, like you love the kids, you guide the kids, you teach the kids, this is how you parent, this is how you discipline, you're red, right? Everything you do is red. And parent A, the way you love, the discipline, the way you nurture, you're blue. And you've always been blue. If parent one sends the children over to parent A's house expecting red, you've set them up to fail. And that is the most common dynamic because parent A is blue. And so these parents really need to recognize they were always red and blue, right? Even though we know in a system, maybe it looked a little more like hovering red, but they were, and now they're dividing. And oftentimes these parents are fighting over which color is better. And it's like, no, you're red and blue. And then we can help parents to accept those differences. This would move along much more smoothly for these kids.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. I also like that you use parent one and A as opposed
There's a reason for that, Katie.
but I hear you avoiding the hierarchy.
Yeah, well, and I would tell you that we used to say parent one and parent two when we drew dynamics, and parent two was unhappy with that. And so we did. We changed it to parent one and parent A.
Very nice. But it's interesting how sensitive they are to that kind. I mean, because it's been so conflicting, I imagine. There's just sensitivity.
They're very sensitive to it, and in fact, it's because there's one of the things that's going on in the family. One of the significant things that's going on in the family is the power dynamic is so skewed, and even a little thing like calling it parent A instead of parent two keeps the power in a balanced way in the family. If you were to say parent one and parent two, you shift the power, even if it's just a little bit. And in these family systems, that's critical. I'll give you another example. I'm sure that all of us as therapists have encouraged our clients to take the high road in difficulties, right? But we are not fans of the high road, because if you're on the high road, Katie, what road does that put your conflicted co-parent on?
The low road.
The low road, right? And if I ask your conflicted co-parent what road they're on, they're going to tell me the high road, of course, right? And so if you're both on the high road and you're in court and you're going to therapy, your children are stressed, you're spending thousands of dollars on therapy and tens of thousands of dollars on court cases and legal fees, then I'm going to suggest that the high road's not very helpful to families. And so what we encourage families to do is to get away from that hierarchy, right? You know, this is a little bit of our Adlerianism coming out. You know, Adler called it superiority and inferiority.
Right.
In family systems, it's really about power. And as therapists, it's probably, in working with these families, it's a better approach to not introduce those kinds of hierarchies in the family, but help them realize that just being their best sense of self, doing the best they can, recognizing they're going to make mistakes. The other parent is going to make mistakes as well. Everybody's going to make mistakes, because that's just the nature of being a human being.
Right.
That's okay. That doesn't have to disrupt the family. That there's actually processes they can learn to help manage mistakes and not let it derail the family movement forward.
And we have to remember that there's hierarchies all around. And so, as Joe's mentioning, right? So if you're down here, you always want to be up here. You're going to fight for that position. But if we understand the court system, so parenting time is a legal issue. So they will have somebody, sometimes they'll hire what we call a custody evaluator to decide what the parenting time schedule can be. And if it's not equal, 50-50, that's 60-40, this person will likely keep fighting to get to the 50 because they feel like they're in a one-down position, even though that may not be the case, right? I think we try to help parents that get really into this fairness idea. It has to be fair and equal. And we talk more about equity, right? Sometimes you get your way, sometimes they get their way. At the end of the day, after the end of these 18 years, it's probably a wash down the line. But they will fight down to the last minute. You know what? You had the kids an extra 10 minutes. I want compensatory time for that. I want my 10 minutes. And become so rigid, right? That movement. So think about what the kids have to move through in that little space. That 10 minutes became more important than the relationships.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking about, was how, like, what I saw a lot of was fighting over time. What you guys are describing, this sort of like, he got an extra Saturday afternoon or some crap like that. But it was like his birthday and he wanted the kids to be there. And so when I heard you say equity, I think about giving according to need, not according to like equal, but like what does somebody need? So equity is about sort of negotiating that. And I imagine that's a piece of what you do, is about how to negotiate in an equitable way.
And the language you will hear the most often if you work with these families is what's best for the kids. So in Minnesota, we have a best interest factor, right, that lays out kind of state statute, what's really important, like really, but parents will use it in a subjective way. It's best that if I celebrate the birthday with my child. Yeah. Well, maybe, right, perhaps, and perhaps there's another perspective on that. right? And perhaps your child wants to do something different also. And so what happens is that those views get so rigid that this is best, and really they're just not honoring each other's perspectives, that it can be okay. It, like, again, it goes back to that grief. I can hear you're really disappointed that you're not getting your child for their birthday this year. It's really important to you, right? But their conflict becomes more important than the child, and they miss that. They miss that often. And so because it's more, we would say it's more important to win, but they would say, no, it's just what's best for my child. That's the view they take. And I think, to me, that really comes out of that grief and hurt, instead of actually sitting in those losses, the expectations of what I thought divorce would be like, or how I thought my life would go with my children, right? And so they don't honor that space. They get stuck in that space.
Well, it seems like to some extent that hierarchy that maybe they keep fighting against or creating, perhaps because of all these other people in their system, is part of the rigidity. And is part of what then generates chaos, but is another place to fight about. I mean, another place to sort of do the teeter-totter you guys were describing.
Right, yeah.
That's exactly right. And one of the things that makes it challenging for everybody is that this is a very common thing in our society. You know, we like competition and athletics and all these things, which is great. I enjoy them too. I have nothing against that. But, you know, that saying about, you know, after an event, after a competition, you leave it on the field, leave it on the court, leave it on whatever, is because that way of interacting with each other is not a really good way to act in our families, right? Families are not about winning and losing the way competition is. But that's exactly what these families do, and especially when they're in the court system. Because that's why they think they're going to win in the court system, and they're not. The court is there to create structures to help families move forward, to help people heal. In some situations like domestic violence, to protect people. Sure. But they're not there to determine a winner and a loser.
And you're going to hear language, right, from when people pull apart. It's all those shoulds, right? The shoulds of the family system. But you might have had roles, like somebody was the main breadwinner, went to work, the other parent stayed home with the children. So you sometimes take on roles in a system. And then we get divorced. And now the role of this person is, well, now you're going to work and take care of the children. And now but this person might say, well, I always stayed home with the children. I should get to stay home. I should have more time. And that's the court systems don't quite view it that way. Yeah. And so they step back and go, what does each parent need to do we look at parenting time as a responsibility. What does each parent need to do to be responsible to care for their child, right? Rearrange your living expenses. So there's so much that's happening. But I think society has these shoulds that's not always helpful. Well, she should get more time. Or he should get, there's all these shoulds that come out there, and we all carry some of those beliefs. I think as students, we need to really evaluate ourselves, like what are those biases that sit with us based on our own upbringing, right? The things we recognize as fair, right? And what should happen, because it doesn't play out very well in this kind of system, right?
Yeah, well, and as you guys said, the family loses in the process.
And the family really loses.
The children in particular kind of bear the burden of that as a result. So I have, well, I guess I have a couple of questions. One is, how do you two sustain doing this work? Because these families, this is me talking as a person, holy cow. Like I remember, like, I mean, I had a PhD in family therapy by the time I saw them, and I was still like y'all are exhausting. So I'm curious how you guys sustain it, or what drives you to stay in this work.
So first and foremost, to do this work, you need excellent self-care. You need excellent self-care. I would say that for any profession, but especially this profession, because you will get pulled in. I would say doing a lot of didactic work before you do this work, because boy, will you find your stuff come out really quickly in this. And you won't even realize how much stuff you might think you've done a lot of work on yourself until you sit in a room with people screaming at you, yelling at you, right? So you will learn. take the opportunity to learn and grow. Don't, like, I think it's easy for us to go, it's them. I think it's better for us to go, whoa, that was really triggering to me. I need to work on myself. So a lot of that self-growth is really important. Consulting, right? Doing a lot of consultation about these clients. You cannot do this alone, right? There is no alone in this. It's too hard. And you really do need to be able to think in perspective, because our biases do get in the way from time to time. You know, every once in a while I make the joke that I'm leaving, and I'm like, I'm done. I just can't do another day of this, right?
She does. I hear about it.
I'm like, that's it. I'm done, right? But I think what keeps me back is that I really care about families, and I believe that they can. Small changes make a big impact on children, and I need to look at it. My children are going to play with your children, and my children's children, my grandchildren, your grandchildren are going to play each other. And part of why I do this is I want to create a world where people actually learn to get along and can also understand how to manage conflict and differences and find acceptance. And so I recognize, so when I'm working with a family, I recognize that they impact so many people, right? It's not just this family, but how they impact. And so we have to look at these families with a long lens that right now they're stuck, and someday they're going to have families and they're going to have families. So it's very generational. So my hope is that in the work that we do, we create sometimes just small change. Some days it feels like there's nothing happening, but even that small change can be a big change 3 generations down.
Right.
I think I do it, Katie, because I know that these parents love their children more than anything, and I know that it's incredibly distressing for a parent when they can't be with their child, or there's some struggle, and it creates fear, and it creates, I think, fear for the children, whether it's a real fear or a perceived fear. It's very real.
Sure.
Or a factual fear versus a perceived fear. It's very real, and I think that's partly where that's where I feel a lot of compassion and a lot of caring, and I get pulled into it that way, because I want to help them have that voice both ways, everybody in the family, to be able to express their love. Because sometimes we feel this love, and by the time it gets out of our hearts into our behaviors, it gets all wonky and messed up, and that's where we can be really helpful as family therapists, is helping to make that more streamlined, more effective, more helpful, more nurturing expressions of love. I think I stay in it because it is incredibly difficult, but I stay in it because I get to work with really wonderful people like you. You know, we met a long time ago, but the community of people are very similar. They really care about families, and it just feels right to be in that group of people who care about families. It feels right to be professionally. Lori mentioned a couple times the AFCC, that's the Association of Families and Conciliation Courts. That's a international organization, really caring for people from all over the world that want to help these families. But mostly emotionally, what it is for me is that I know these parents love their children more than anything else, and those children deserve to feel that love. And that's partly what keeps me in it. It's a puzzle. How do I put that together for them?
Yeah. Well, so what I'm kind of hearing you guys describe is there's obviously personal work and connection that needs to be present for you in your work environment or with your colleagues. And then also, like, maybe there's something interesting about the work, or something that you talk about putting the puzzle pieces together. My other thought when you were talking was about that idea of there's love in your heart, and when it comes out, it's not maybe the behaviors don't reflect all of what's in there. One of the earliest questions I remember one of my supervisors gave me when I was a master's student, I was working with, I think it was a mom and kid, and she goes, or the supervisor said, well, like, how do you think that kid experiences the parent? And I was like, oh, like, that's a different question, right? Like, there's what the parent intends, and then there's how the child experiences it.
That's right.
But if we can remember the intention, and that sounds like something you do, like try to remember the love and care and concern, and they're
That's
fighting for the most important people in their world.
That's right.
That can help you.
Yeah, and then, sorry, go ahead. There's a saying, I didn't make this up, but I wish I had, that, you know, good intentions are a great place to begin, but a terrible place to end.
Yes.
And I think with these families, that's what happens with this love. They love their children more than anything, and yet, so there's really good intentions there, but whether it was because of their families of origin or trauma or something in their lives, it doesn't end up that way. Their children aren't experiencing that love, and it's very confounding for these people. They want more than anything for their children to feel that love.
Yeah.
And then they start blaming the other parent, which then gets the court system involved and all of that. But I believe it's there. And so it's kind of like a big puzzle, kind of like a Rubik's Cube, which I was never really good at the Rubik's Cube, but I really like that it's challenging. You know, it's never easy, but there's always, if you keep working with people, like Laurie said, this is not work to do alone. You need to be with people doing this work.
Yeah.
You can collaborate and help these families move forward.
Yeah.
I think when I first started working with these clients, like sometimes the way we talk about high conflict or complexity, like it's a special group of people, but these are people that are actually our doctors, our pilots, are the people who are like they could be your next door neighbor, and you would not know. And so making sure that, I think having that systemic lens and really when people are angry or so hurt with what's happening, how do we just hold compassion for them? How do we not jump in and triangulate and pull aside, but how do we really hold compassion? And I think those of us who are individual therapists as well, right, they are going to come through our office and remembering that there's always a bigger picture. There's always a bigger lens. And if we can remind ourselves of that and what our job really is to do, it's not just to listen to somebody vent, but how do we bring awareness? How do we help them through that grief?
Yeah.
Right? I think that's so important to remember. These are our neighbors.
Yeah, you're making me think of, I don't know how familiar you guys are with contextual family therapy, but Naj talked about how the therapist position has to be what he called multi-directional. He called it multi-directional partiality. But essentially, it's what you just described, which is like, I have to think beyond the person sitting in front of me. And I have to consider the impact of what I end up saying, like, take the higher road, or you're right, he's a narcissist. Like, those have impact beyond your room. And so to be thoughtful about other people who are impacted by the interventions we do. And so I always found his concept very helpful for helping people, even if it's an individual, thinking beyond that and its impact. And on systems like this, who are sort of reactive, the impact can be really big.
And remembering that their stories, the individual story is very compelling. It's very, all that pain in it is very compelling. Like, I want to reach out and like, oh my gosh, you have been through a lot, right? But remembering there's that other side, right? It can be both and. Both and.
Yeah. Well, I think we draw from a number of the, I don't know what you want to call it, the traditional theorists of family therapy. Like you just mentioned, Naj. We also are big believers. I think it was Whitaker who said you have to win the battle for structure and let the client win the battle for initiative. That's essential in this work, because otherwise you will be taking care of everybody and you'll burn out in a second and they'll get nowhere. They have to have that initiative to make the appointments and to follow the treatment plan. And then we also see the impact of adultification and parentification, which Bowen, I think, if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, because that's a very real dynamic in working with these families. So we draw a lot of different from a lot of different people, and we also will, we're also willing to do some bold interventions if that's called for. I think we're, when I think of some of the what some of the interventions from the early family therapists were. You know, I don't know, I just read about it. I wasn't there, obviously, but I have this idea that it was a little bit callous or a little bit nonchalant, but I'd like to think that we're more compassionate and thoughtful. Maybe that's too judgmental, but we also, sometimes these families need some big interventions as well. And I think we shouldn't be afraid to do that if it's called for. And that's where it's hard. That's where you need consultation to figure out is that reasonable or is that too much?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I say to my students, and now they recite it back to me, which is fun as they're like graduating, but I always say, you can say about anything in therapy with the right tone and compassion. So like, I'm a really direct therapist. I love all the things you're talking about, the structure, which is one of the reasons I think Deb Link thought I would be good at this work. But anyway, so like I'll land a really direct comment or do a pretty bold intervention, but it will sound soft and caring and kind because I want it to hit their ears, right? Like I want them to like take it in as opposed to like get defensive, which I imagine is maybe part of your approach too.
Correct. In fact, Lori has the reputation amongst us colleagues that she's the most compassionate therapist around, and she delivers that compassion with the 2x4. So, and I think that's appropriate. I think it's appropriate. I think you're right. I think we have to be direct. I mean, that's what we're paid to do. We're paid to tell them what perspective we see. I don't think we should say we're right and they're wrong about that. I think we should open it up for them to speak back into that and tell us, you know, how did it land on you and what their perspective is, and be open to, you know, maybe fine tuning our statements, but we're supposed to give them perspective. That's why they come to us.
Well, I think it's really important to the other pieces. We're doing a lot of skill building with them. They come to us with so many distortions, right? And so we need to help them think of alternative perspectives, right? We don't need to give them all of the alternative. We're like, could it be something else? Let's try this. But we really need to help them get outside of that box that they're stuck in and see it from somebody else's position. And so there are those skills that we're often putting into the clinical work as well.
Yeah. Well, now I want to know what a compassionate 2x4.
I think it's exactly how you described yourself, Katie, right? Like I think of it, you know, it's interesting. I think that's how I am as a parent, right? If you want to look at it through that lens, right? Yeah. So I'm extremely compassionate. I'm a very authoritative parent, right? I give choices and options, but boy, am I firm. And so, right? And so, because I believe structure is important, right? And sometimes it's really important that someone hears the message, right? And so I do look at life through that both and right lens. And so I do sometimes think when I'm talking to parents, this would be how I would be talking to my teenager or my, right? So I can hold I can understand, I can validate, I can have compassion, and I'm going to be really clear with my message to you.
Right. Now that makes sense to me. and I still want to see the 2x4. I love that image. Because I think when it lands, it does hit people pretty squarely, and it does become something they can't not see or walk away from, or.
And that is being compassionate in our field, to tell them the truth that as far as you see it, and give them perspective and choices. That is compassion in our work. To not tell them the truth is not being compassionate.
Right.
I can't think of a week that doesn't go by that somebody has said, I don't like what you said to me. I'm not happy with this. I don't agree with you. And then they will likely come back and say, okay, I thought about it. Yeah. Right? I thought, because at least the way I put it out, they can be mad at me. And I'm like, you know, I'm really glad you're letting me know how angry you are. You have a lot of feelings about that. That makes sense. You should be skeptical. Right? Let's play it out. But they really need to start kind of looking at those different perspectives. And of course, to get to that place with the client, we're going to have to build some relationship first.
Yeah, that's that last part right there about some skepticism, because I think there's a really healthy place for that, right? For them to digest it and think about it, and not necessarily just be reactive to it, but really sort of let it. I imagine with these families and getting away from the rigidity, you do want to encourage their thoughtfulness and reflection.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. And we have to be careful with those clients because as therapists, we do validate them, which I think is really good role modeling for them to do with other people. But sometimes they look at validation as, just commiserating, right? Or you're on my side, you agree with me, right? And so we need to be very mindful that we're not joining them that way.
Yeah, well, in agreement.
Yes, in agreement that your position is right, your other parent is awful. That's not what we want to be doing. But we do want to, I understand, I can hear this has been really hard. So we do want to be able to validate them. We need to make sure we're not, I think sometimes as individual therapists, we want the anxiety of these clients, the compassion we feel can spill over into joining in a way that's actually not healthy or not productive, right? We want to make sure we're kind of just standing out here and understanding.
Yeah.
I think for therapists, especially maybe newer therapists, it's important to be comfortable with your client's skepticism because they get to be skeptical. That's part of their struggle that's going on inside of themselves, and they have something to contribute to the statement that you've made that created the skepticism as well. And I think it's important for them to participate in that. And that's part of what therapy is. That's why therapy takes so long and so hard. I mean, if you think about our personalities, they're remarkably stable. You go to bed at night and you wake up the next morning and you're the same person, right? And despite all sorts of data to the contrary, we still make bad decisions sometimes, or imperfect decisions, right? So we're remarkably stable in our personalities. So it takes them time to work through that. It has to work all the way through their whole sense of self. For all of us, that's the case if we're in therapy. And skepticism is part of that. That just means that they're working through it.
And remembering that everything is therapeutic. Everything is therapeutic because even if they don't like something or they're triggered, a lot of times their movement is away. They want to quit. They're done because they felt vulnerable, right? And they're, being exposed in some way. And so, I will sometimes have somebody say, that's it, I'm quitting. And I said, well, I invite you back to have that conversation. Let's talk about why you want to quit, right? Everything becomes therapeutic because these are folks sometimes that don't know how to be vulnerable or how to do some of the difficult. So we don't want to just, fine, go. We want to really help them know that you can be in this. Like you can be angry, we can disagree, we can hold this place together. And so really, I think the angrier clients get with me, the more compassion I get. I don't know how it ends up being that, but I think I used to get a little more triggered in that space. But over time, you become more and more compassionate, and I get calmer. My tone is quiet and slow, like I'm just, right? And they will slow down, right? But everything creates movement where they speed up and they're away, they're angry, they're away. So just remembering that, just staying in that compassionate, soft place will hold them closer.
Yeah, actually, as you were saying that, I was thinking like that's like my parenting goal is to get calmer and calmer as my kids are like ratcheting up in their anger. I found humor to be helpful too in those moments. So I'm kind of winding down with questions here. I don't know though if there's anything else you think is important that we haven't talked about yet that you think would be important for new therapists to know about this work or your approach.
I think if you want to work with families that are conflicted or complex systems, like we've already said, it's really, really fascinating work. It's difficult work. It's fascinating. I would encourage you to look into the AFCC. They have written out, have your students done that, or?
No, but I'll go grab those. That's a good idea.
Yeah, they have a whole ethical guidelines for working with complex or court-ordered families, court-involved families.
Awesome.
Their website, I believe, is afcc.org. That's the national website. There's state chapters in every state. I believe the state chapter is in St. Louis for Missouri. And you can just Google it. It'll come up. It'll give you a direct link to the website. That would be the first place I would start. It lays out, the ethical guidelines are all laid out really clearly. And then I would get connected with a group of people that do it. Get in a consultation group. Start out small, because it's gonna, like Lori said a few minutes ago, you're going to get triggered. It's okay. It's gonna trigger your stuff, your countertransference, and
Sure.
but I want you to know it'll make you a better therapist by doing that. And don't be afraid of that. Just have a good group of people around you for support. The other thing I would just invite your students, Katie, now that the bridging class is online, they are welcome to sit through anytime they want for free.
Okay.
I know you've sat through it when it was in person. Other people around the country, there's a few therapists in St. Louis who are going to be sitting through it.
Awesome.
Just go to our website, bridgingparentalconflict.com or thebridgingcenter.com. Either way, we'll get to the bridging class.
Okay.
Pick a date and just let us know. Even if it says no longer available, that's for participants, for parents, but
Sure.
Professionals are welcome to sit through for free. Just let us know and we'd be glad to have you. And you can see us work with the parents right in the class and what that looks like.
Awesome.
Those are some thoughts on getting involved.
Yeah, well, and so those are good examples of like the education piece of what you guys do. And maybe, is that a part of like parent coaching too? You kind of start with that class?
Yes. In fact, go.
No, go ahead. Oh, I think it's great. I think the last time you took it, Katie, I was like, I think we were still at Phoenix.
Yeah.
So that was a while
Yeah.
ago. And so the class has really evolved. And so what I would tell people just in the education that we do, that the class has evolved based from our own experience doing the clinical work, but we have gotten hundreds and hundreds of sheets of evaluative feedback from parents, and we've made the changes from their feedback, right? Like, how do we make this a better class for these folks? And right, who better to get that information from than the people who are living this? And so I think the class has evolved really nicely. And when we have students or professionals take the class, they give us feedback as well, because we don't stand here to know everything, right? We learn from one another in a community, and that's really important. So we all continue to grow.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, I think my students would love that. Because part of what they're trying to figure out is like, what does this look like? Or how do I translate what I'm learning into a career, right? Into something that can actually help people, like why I decided to do this. And so I think your class is a good example of that, where you sort of begin this coaching process with parents and use an educational platform to do some of that.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when you're coming out of grad school or you're coming out of your program, sometimes you just have to get into some work and figure out some things you don't like and some things you do. And what I found is the farther you get into the work itself, generally speaking, the more your focus or interest will start to narrow. You know, you'll go like this. So 10 years from now, it may be really crystal clear what you're interested in, where now if there's just all sorts of roads that are open to you. And I think that's appropriate to get in experiences in those different roads as a professional. And I wouldn't be afraid of that. It's part of your process of figuring out what road is really right for you.
Right. Yeah, there's a faculty member here who calls it getting seasoned, you know, like you're new. And so we got to get all the different, like try a little bit of this and a little bit of that and get sort of seasoned to kind of figure out or have enough experience to say, here's where I think here's what I'm interested in, or here's what I know about. And
the path is not straight. It is not a straight path. It's you jump in because sometimes as a therapist, we take the first job we can get. And we start there and it just starts moving. And to your point, you did this high conflict work and you decided, you know what, I might be pretty good at it and I think I'm better at something else, right? Or my heart or my passion lies somewhere else. So yeah, there's movement, always movement.
Yeah, I certainly figured that out where my passion was. But I also figured out like where my triggers were. So you talked earlier about that and I got hit a few times and I was like, I don't know if I can.
Yeah.
But I also figured out where some of my tender spots were. And so it helps me then know, like, can I tolerate this and work through it? You know, some self-care, some consultation, or now I have people here in St. Louis. I'm like, you know who you should go see?
Yes.
I'm not your person for this, but I know people. And that's maybe the collegial part of it, where we build our own system or group of support as therapists.
Absolutely.
We have one of our clinical mentors. He always told us that whatever happens inside of you, try to figure out how to use it for the client's benefit. And if you can't, then use it for your own direction. Like, do I go this way or this way in my profession, right? You're part of it. We're all part of the therapy that's happening, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. But
Right.
we do have to learn how to use it skillfully so we don't do any harm for people.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. That's wonderful. Any last thoughts? I'm going to put links to the AFCC guidelines and then your guys' class, or your website with the class. I just want to say thank you. I so appreciate your time. I know you guys are busy and doing the work in cold Minnesota.
It's 82 today.
Oh, wow, you guys really rebounded. That's awesome.
But tomorrow it's going to be 60.
And so goes the fall in Minnesota.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I so appreciate your time, and thank you so much for sharing your depth of knowledge and experience with my class. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you for all your support around it. Your students may not know, but when you did sit through it, you had some great feedback for us about 6 or 7 years ago, and I think you were the one that encouraged us to make it more trauma informed than it was, and we did.
Look at that.
Look at that. We're all connected, Katie.
Yeah, so we really appreciate you and the work you've done and the support you've given us as well.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.